This is my review of Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason by Foucault. So he's kind of like a big philosopher thinker, and this was assigned for one of my classes. I will say this was a very difficult read because pretty much what he's trying to do is talk about madness, which can be thought of as like mental illnesses, different conditions that we now formally recognize with official definitions and stuff, and go back through hundreds of years and see how were people like this treated, all the way back then, and then walk through each of the shifts in culture that occurred to change how do we view these people who may have these mental illnesses, who we don't quite understand, who may do things that we don't understand. And a lot of people argue today that the way we treat those with mental illnesses is still not what it should be, and that there's definitely an argument to be made for that. I think just reading this book though, it really just makes you realize whoa, we hundreds of years ago, they used to just put people in these buildings and then just chain them to the floors. And they also had because the science was so archaic back then, they had no idea of what to do. So it's anybody's guesswork. So there was one point where they would just not heat the building because they believed that cold would be good for them. And they realized that for some reason, it seemed that all these people who had all, this madness or whatever you may call it, seemed to survive in the cold well. And that other people would, survive in the cold, and then as soon as they're let out, they'll go outside and they'll put more ice on themselves, which makes no sense. So they also had this thing where they thought that ice baths and pouring cold water on people and cold showers would somehow fix it. And there's all these crazy different things. And because there's no systematic way to really prove what's going on, or even to have a model of the brain of okay, what part's being affected, or what, or the drugs and molecules, right? You can't necessarily do anything to fix it because you just have no idea of how the human body in general works. Today, we can at least have a direction to go in and can understand, okay, well, we have certain drugs that do certain things that can help reduce the, recurrence of hallucinations and things like that. So we have at least a direction. But back then, they're really just grasping at straws. And so they're trying all these different things. A lot of times they're kind of, in a sense, manipulating the patients in a way to try to, reduce their delusions by acting like they're part of the delusion. So for example, apparently there's this one guy who thought he was dead, and because he knew that dead people don't eat, he didn't want to eat, and he was going to die because he was going to starve himself to death without realizing it. So they dressed up as a bunch of dead people, and then they came into his room, and they sat down, and they started eating, and they asked him, "Why aren't you eating?" And then after that point, he realized that, oh, maybe dead people do eat, and so he started eating. So I think this, of course, is very, morally questionable, but you see how they take all these different approaches to try to get to, the kind of, in a sense, the same answer that we get to today. For example, if somebody was not eating and they had schizophrenia or any of these other mental illnesses, right, we would try to get them to actually eat because otherwise they would kind of waste away. And so it's interesting how back then they didn't really have a lot of, advanced fancy understandings or mechanisms or medicines and things. So they just had to just think of something and try to see if it works. And if it doesn't work, try something else. And I think that there's a lot of problems with that, but it does show the ingenuity of the human mind in the sense that the people who were in these kind of clinics, they understood people very well. And even though I would agree that there was a lot of stigma at that time, they didn't let that stop them from trying to, help these people, which I think was interesting. Now, of course, yes, there was a lot of abuse, and in the early days, they just tried to beat people into submission, which was, absolutely horrific. But I mean, you start to see a little bit of awakening and a realization that, okay, this is not the way to go. And one really interesting argument throughout this book is that Foucault argues that madness is in a sense not completely illogical. Because if we go back to the person where, they didn't want to eat because they thought they were dead, that's actually a very rational statement in the sense that if you think you are dead, that you shouldn't eat because dead people don't eat. That's, of course we don't think we're dead. That's the problem, right? But if you just take that statement on its own, it's actually rational. So it shows that, in a sense, their brain is working. It's just the context which that's taken out of and applied to themselves is incorrect. So it really questions the idea that madness is just complete, just falling off the edge completely and being completely crazy. It shows that no, in reality, there is an inkling of just like rational thought there. And he even talks about, very prominent kind of philosophers and thinkers like Nietzsche, who did end up going kind of mad or did end up losing their mind in the end. And one big question he had is, well, like if civilization is based off a lot of painters, a lot of people who did really great things and were really creative, and they were kind of on that borderline of like almost, maybe potentially having mental conditions. And that could be attributed to the fact that they were able to be more creative and see things and make connections that actually, fundamentally shaped our society. Then doesn't that like bring in this whole argument of madness and how to treat people with these kind of illnesses into a different light? Because it's almost like the entire society and the values which Western civilization is built on, that is used to judge these people, is in a sense almost made from some of them. And so I thought that was a really eye-opening kind of thought of that the system itself, which perpetuates stigma and kind of harmful stuff, but it's also trying to benefit them in some ways, but towards people with mental illnesses, could have actually been created by some people who are closer maybe to the people with mental illnesses than they are to, like, let's say normal, average, just thinking everyday people. So yeah, this book is definitely a very deep read. There's a lot of references to things I didn't quite understand, because I mean this was written like quite a while ago, and there's a lot of like paintings and stuff that he just talks about as if like people know them, and I didn't quite know them, so it was kind of hard to follow there. But I think overall it's a very interesting way to look at how culture shapes kind of illness and our understanding of illness, and why do we have the stigmas we have today, and why do we have certain precedents in the sense of mental illness that we have today. So I thought it was a pretty good book overall. And yeah, if you have any other questions, put them in the comments. Make sure you subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.